Karen Smith gripped the bolt cutters tightly as she peered around the corner of her neighbor's garage. It was nearly 3 a.m., but the glow of the full moon illuminated the sleek black Jeep Wrangler sitting in the driveway. Her eyes narrowed as she spotted the thick chain looped through the steering wheel. Asterisk, no problem, asterisk, she thought, a devious smile spreading across her face. Darting forward, Karen quickly snipped through the chain, tossing the broken links to the ground. She pulled open the driver's side door and hopped inside, slamming it shut behind her. Asterisk, funnily, that Iser will be gone for good, asterisk, she thought triumphantly, turning the key in the ignition. But instead of the Jeep roaring to life, a series of high-pitched beeps filled the air. Karen's heart dropped as red and blue lights began flashing all around her. What the? She started, just as a voice blared over a loudspeaker. This is the police. Step out of the vehicle with your hands up. Karen's hands flew up in panic as the driver's side door was yanked open. Two burly officers in tactical gear dragged her out of the Jeep and slammed her against the side of the vehicle, barking orders to keep still. As they slapped handcuffs on her wrists, Karen could only stare in bewilderment. Asterisk, how could this have happened? Asterisk. Just then, her neighbor, James, emerged from his house, a smug grin on his face. Looks like you picked the wrong Jeep to steal, Karen, he called out. This one's been rigged with a GPS tracker and a silent alarm system, courtesy of the local auto theft task force. Karen's mouth dropped open as the reality of the situation sank in. You did this? She sputtered, struggling against the officer's grip. James shrugged nonchalantly. Let's just say I've had my eye on you for a while, Karen. Always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong and making everyone's lives miserable. He shook his head in mock disappointment. Didn't your precious HOA handbook teach you anything about respecting your neighbor's property? Karen felt her face burning with humiliation as the officers began to read her Miranda rights. Asterisk, how could this have all gone so wrong? Asterisk, she wondered, her mind racing. She had been so careful, so sure that she would get away with it. But now, as the police car doors slammed shut behind her, Karen knew that her reign of terror was finally over. Karen sat in the hard, metal chair, her wrists still cuffed in front of her. She glared at the two detectives as they entered the dimly lit interrogation room, their faces set in stern expressions. All right, Ms. Smith, the older detective, a gruff-looking man with a bushy mustache, began. Care to explain what exactly you were doing trying to steal your neighbor's Jeep in the middle of the night? Karen tossed her head defiantly. I have no idea what you're talking about. I was just taking a late-night stroll when I heard some suspicious noises coming from my neighbor's property. I was simply investigating a potential break-in, as any concerned citizen would do. The younger detective, a woman with sharp features and piercing eyes, leaned forward. Cut the crap, Karen. We have you on camera cutting through that chain and trying to make off with the vehicle. Not to mention, your neighbor James has been keeping a close eye on you for months, ever since you started causing trouble in the neighborhood. Karen's eyes narrowed. That sniveling little weasel set me up. He's the one who's been harassing me and the rest of the HOA for years. I was just trying to teach him a lesson. The male detective let out a frustrated sigh. Look, Miss Smith, we've got you dead to rights here. The only question is, how much trouble do you want to be in? He leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. You could be facing some serious charges, breaking and entering, grand theft auto, resisting arrest. But maybe if you cooperate and give us the full story, we can work something out. Karen's mind raced as she weighed her options. On one hand, she desperately wanted to maintain her innocence and refused to back down. But the thought of spending time behind bars was not exactly appealing, especially with her spotless record. Asterisk, maybe I can talk my way out of this. Asterisk, she thought, straightening her posture. All right, officers, she said, her voice dripping with feigned sincerity. I'll tell you everything I know, but I want to make it clear that I was only trying to protect my community from a nuisance. You have to understand that Jeep has been an eyesore for months, and James has been terrorizing the HOA with his constant complaints and rule breaking. I was simply trying to take matters into my own hands. The detectives exchanged a skeptical glance, but remained silent, waiting for Karen to continue. As she launched into her carefully crafted explanation, Karen couldn't help but feel a twinge of confidence. Asterisk, maybe, just maybe I can talk my way out of this mess. Asterisk, she thought, a faint smile playing on her lips. Karen spoke with an air of practiced innocence, weaving an elaborate tale of how she had stumbled upon the scene and only intended to investigate the situation, not steal the Jeep. The detectives listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, their expressions unreadable. So, you're telling us that you were just trying to be a good Samaritan and stop a potential theft? The female detective asked, her brow furrowed. Exactly, Karen exclaimed, nodding vigorously. I'm the victim here, not the criminal. That Jeep has been an eyesore in our perfectly manicured neighborhood for far too long, and James has been a thorn in the HOA's side for years. I was simply trying to take matters into my own hands and restore some order. The male detective leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. But you do realize that breaking the law to restore order is still breaking the law, right? We have you on camera cutting that chain and trying to steal a vehicle. Karen waved a dismissive hand. Oh, please, I was just trying to move the Jeep to a more appropriate location, not steal it. And those alarms and trackers, that's just James trying to frame me. He's the one who's been causing all the trouble, not me. The female detective let out a dry chuckle. Well, that's certainly an interesting theory, Ms. Smith. But the evidence we have paints a pretty clear picture of what really happened. You broke the law, plain and simple. Now, the question is, how do you want to handle this? Karen's confident facade began to crumble as the weight of the situation sank in. She had been so sure that she could talk her way out of this. But the detectives seemed unimpressed by her excuses. Asterisk thing, Karen think, asterisk, she urged herself, her mind racing. Look, I know I may have overstepped a bit, she said, feigning contrition. But I was only trying to protect my community. Surely you can understand that. If you just let me go, I promise I'll never set foot near that Jeep again. I'll even apologize to James and the rest of the HOA. Just, please don't ruin my life over this. The detectives exchanged another glance, their expressions inscrutable. Karen held her breath, praying that her pleas would somehow sway them. After a long, tense silence, the male detective sighed and shook his head. Sorry, Miss Smith, but that's not how this works. You broke the law, and there are consequences for that. Now we can either do this the easy way, where you cooperate fully and we work with the prosecutor to see if we can get you a reduced sentence, or we can do it the hard way, where you continue to deny everything and you end up with the book thrown at you. Your choice. Karen felt her heart sink as the gravity of the situation truly hit her. Asterisk, this can't be happening. Asterisk, she thought, her mind racing. Asterisk, he was supposed to be the one in control, not the one being controlled. Asterisk, with a resigned sigh, she nodded slowly, realizing that her reign of terror had finally come to an end. As Karen was led out of the police station in handcuffs, the reality of her situation began to sink in. She had always prided herself on her ability to manipulate the system and get her way, but this time, her carefully crafted plan had backfired spectacularly. The walk to the waiting squad car felt like an eternity, with Karen's mind racing as she tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Asterisk, how could this have gone so wrong? Asterisk, she wondered, her stomach churning with a mixture of fear and shame. When they arrived at the county jail, Karen was processed and booked, her fingerprints and mugshot taken as part of the standard procedure. As she sat in the holding cell, surrounded by the sounds of other inmates and the harsh fluorescent lighting, she couldn't help but feel a profound sense of humiliation. Asterisk, this is all James' fault. Asterisk, she thought bitterly, clutching the thin, scratchy blanket that had been provided to her. Asterisk, if he hadn't set me up, I'd be back in my cozy little house, planning my next move. Asterisk. The thought of her neighbor's smug grin only served to fuel her anger, and she paced the small cell, her mind whirring with plans for revenge. But as the hours ticked by, Karen's bravado began to fade, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The reality of her situation was starting to sink in. She was facing serious charges, and the prospect of spending time behind bars was no longer just a vague possibility, but a very real and terrifying prospect. Asterisk, maybe I should have just listened to James and the HOA. Asterisk, she thought, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Asterisk, if I had just played by the rules, none of this would have happened. Asterisk, the irony of the situation was not lost on her. The very person who had made it her mission to enforce the rules and maintain order in her community was now the one facing the consequences of her own lawlessness. As the sun began to rise outside the jail's barred windows, Karen finally allowed herself to admit the truth. Her reign as the self-appointed queen of the HOA was over. The realization hit her like a ton of bricks, and she felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of loneliness and despair. Asterisk, what am I going to do now? Asterisk, she wondered, her mind racing with uncertainty. With her reputation in tatters and her freedom hanging in the balance, Karen knew that her life would never be the same. As the weight of her actions began to truly sink in, she finally allowed the tears to fall, her sobs echoing through the empty cell. In the days that followed, Karen's world continued to unravel. After her initial interrogation, she was formally charged with breaking and entering, grand theft auto, and resisting arrest. The evidence against her was overwhelming, and her attempts to shift the blame onto her neighbor James only served to further undermine her credibility. As the news of her arrest spread through the community, Karen found herself the subject of intense scrutiny and criticism. Her fellow HOA members, once cowed by her domineering personality, now openly mocked and derided her, openly questioning how she could have let her personal vendetta against James spiral so out of control. Even worse, Karen's own family and friends began to distance themselves, unwilling to be associated with the infamous HOA Karen and the legal mess she had created. Suddenly, the woman who had once been the center of attention and the driving force behind the neighborhood's strict rules and regulations found herself isolated and alone, her once formidable social standing crumbling around her. Trapped in the county jail, Karen was forced to confront the harsh realities of her situation. The once confident woman who had always been able to manipulate the system to her advantage now found herself at the mercy of the very justice system she had so often flouted. The prospect of a lengthy prison sentence weighed heavily on her, and she spent countless hours pacing her cell, trying to devise a way out of her predicament. But as the days turned into weeks, Karen's desperation only grew. Her pleas for leniency fell on deaf ears, and the prosecutors remained steadfast in their determination to hold her accountable for her actions. The once indomitable HOA Karen was reduced to a shadow of her former self, her pride and sense of control slipping away with each passing day. Finally, the day of her trial arrived, and Karen found herself standing before a judge, her fate hanging in the balance. As the evidence was presented and the charges were read-aloud, she felt a sinking feeling in the pit of her stomach. Realizing that there was no way out of this mess, the judge's stern expression and the jury's unwavering gaze only served to heighten her sense of dread and despair. In the end, the verdict was swift and unforgiving. Karen was found guilty on all counts, and the judge sentenced her to a lengthy prison term, citing her blatant disregard for the law and the harm she had caused to the community. As the bailiffs led her away, Karen could only stare straight ahead, her mind numb with the realization that her reign of terror had finally come to a devastating end. The first few months in prison were the hardest for Karen. Stripped of her power and influence, she found herself struggling to adapt to the harsh realities of life behind bars. The constant noise, the tight quarters, and the ever-present threat of violence all conspired to chip away at her once formidable sense of control. But as the weeks turned into months, Karen began to slowly come to terms with her new reality. She found solace in the prison's educational programs, throwing herself into her studies with a newfound determination. The structure and routine of prison life, once so foreign and oppressive, began to provide the sense of stability that she had sorely missed. It was during this time that Karen began to re-evaluate her priorities and her outlook on life. The endless hours spent in her cell, away from the distractions and temptations of the outside world, allowed her to reflect on the choices that had led her to this point. She realized, with a growing sense of shame, that her obsession with power and control had blinded her to the needs and concerns of those around her. Gradually, Karen began to shed the old persona of HOA Karen and started to see herself in a new light. Instead of focusing on enforcing rules and regulations, she turned her attention to helping her fellow inmates, volunteering in the prison's educational and rehabilitation programs. She became a mentor to the younger women, offering them guidance and support as they navigated the challenges of life behind bars. As her transformation continued, Karen's reputation within the prison began to shift. The other inmates, once wary of her overbearing personality, now saw her as a source of strength and stability in the chaotic world of incarceration. The prison staff, too, took notice of her positive attitude and her willingness to give back, and they began to advocate on her behalf, recommending her for early parole consideration. It was a slow and arduous process, but with each passing day, Karen felt a renewed sense of purpose and determination. The weight of her past mistakes still weighed heavily on her, but she found solace in the knowledge that she was finally making a positive impact on the lives of those around her. As the day of her parole hearing approached, Karen found herself filled with a mixture of trepidation and hope. She knew that the road to redemption would be a long and difficult one, but she was more determined than ever to prove that she had truly changed. With a renewed sense of purpose and a deep desire to make amends, Karen faced her future with a newfound resolve, determined to create a life that would make up for the damage she had caused. The day of Karen's parole hearing arrived, and as she stood before the parole board, she felt a mixture of nervousness and cautious optimism. The past several months had been a transformative journey, and she was determined to convey the depth of her personal growth and the sincerity of her desire to make amends. As she recounted her journey of self-reflection and rehabilitation, the parole board members listened intently, their expressions unforgettable. Karen spoke eloquently about the mistakes she had made, the lessons she had learned, and the ways in which she had strived to become a positive force within the prison community. I know that my actions in the past have caused a great deal of harm to my community, Karen said, her voice steady and resolute. I take full responsibility for the choices I made, and I am deeply remorseful for the pain and disruption I've caused. But during my time here, I've come to realize that true change and growth can only come from within. She went on to describe the educational programs she had completed, the mentoring she had provided to her fellow inmates, and the ways in which she had worked to make amends and rebuild trust within the community. The parole board members nodded thoughtfully, occasionally jotting down notes as she spoke. When Karen had finished, the board members deliberated for what felt like an eternity. The tension in the room was palpable, and Karen found herself holding her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. Finally, the chairperson of the parole board spoke up, her voice measured and authoritative. Ms. Smith, the board has reviewed your case thoroughly, and we've been impressed by the progress you've made during your incarceration. Your commitment to personal growth and your efforts to positively impact the lives of those around you have not gone unnoticed. Karen felt a glimmer of hope flicker to life within her, but she dared not allow herself to get too excited. That being said, the chairperson continued, the nature of your crimes and the harm you've caused to your community is not something that can be easily forgotten or forgiven. However, we believe that you have demonstrated a genuine commitment to rehabilitation and a strong desire to make amends. The chairperson paused, and Karen held her breath, her palms sweating with anticipation. Therefore, the board has decided to grant you parole with the condition that you continue to participate in community service and counseling programs upon your release. We believe that you have the potential to be a positive force in your community, but it will be up to you to prove that you have truly changed. Karen felt a surge of relief and gratitude wash over her, and she had to resist the urge to break down in tears. She had been given a second chance, and she was determined not to squander it. As the parole board members dismissed her, Karen knew that the true test was yet to come, but she was more ready than ever to face the challenges that lay ahead. As the gates of the prison closed behind her, Karen took a deep, steadying breath. The world outside felt both familiar and foreign, a stark contrast to the confines of her cell. She clutched the small bag of personal belongings, her mind racing with a mix of trepidation and cautious optimism. The drive back to her hometown was filled with a sense of unease. Karen knew that she would have to confront the consequences of her actions, face the community she had once terrorized as the notorious HOA Karen. The prospect filled her with dread, but she was determined to make amends, to show her neighbors that she had truly changed. When she arrived at her old neighborhood, Karen could feel the curious eyes of her former neighbors burning into her. Some shot her looks of disdain, while others simply averted their gaze, unwilling to engage. Taking a deep breath, Karen approached the home of her once nemesis, James. The door opened, and James stood there, his expression unreadable. Karen steeled herself, prepared to face his judgment. "I know I've done terrible things," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I've caused so much pain and disruption, and I can never undo the harm I've done. But I want you to know that I'm a different person now. I've spent the last year in prison, and it's been a journey of self-reflection and growth. I'm ready to make amends, to be a positive force in this community. If you're willing, I'd like to start by apologizing to you and to everyone else I've wronged." James studied her for a long moment, his brow furrowed in contemplation. Then, to Karen's surprise, he extended his hand. "I appreciate your honesty, Karen," he said, his voice surprisingly warm. "It can't have been easy for you to come back here and face us all, but I'm willing to give you a chance if you're truly committed to changing." Karen felt a surge of relief and gratitude, her eyes brimming with tears. Shaking James' hand, she knew that this was just the beginning of a long and challenging journey, but she was ready to embrace it, to prove that she was worthy of a second chance. As she made her way through the neighborhood, reaching out to her former neighbors, Karen could feel the weight of her past slowly lifting. The road ahead was uncertain, but she was determined to forge a new path, one that would hopefully lead to redemption and the restoration of the community she had once sought to control. In the end, Karen's journey had been a painful one, but it had also been a transformative experience. She had learned the true meaning of humility, empathy, and the value of community. And as she looked towards the future, she knew that she would never again take her freedom or her place in the world for granted.